You know that feeling when you meet someone you've admired from a distance and they are nothing like you imagined? Now multiply that by a stadium full of fans who showed up hoping for one decent moment with their favorite star and got treated like an inconvenience instead. We all want to believe that the people we love watching on screen are at least somewhat decent in real life. And sometimes the PR machine works so well that we never find out the truth. But fun's talk, they always talk. And once enough of those stories pile up, a reputation is impossible to hide. Today we're looking at 10 iconic actors, some from Hollywood's golden age, some you grew up watching who had absolutely glowing public images, right up until the fans started telling a very different story. And trust me, a couple of these are going to genuinely surprise you. Wallace Beery. Let's start in the 1930s, because this is honestly where the blueprint for the beloved star, nightmare person story was first written. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's biggest money makers. If you know him at all, you know him from The Champ, the 1931 film where he played this rough, hard-drinking boxer who was also somehow a devoted father. Audiences adored him. He had this image of being the lovable tough guy, someone who was gruff on the outside but warm underneath. That warmth apparently did not exist off camera. Beery was openly hostile to fans who approached him. We're not talking about someone who was shy or preferred his privacy. We're talking about cold stares and harsh dismissals handed out to people who had just paid to see his movies. Studio executives at MGM were well aware of it. They worked overtime to keep that side of him out of the press because his entire career was built on people believing he actually had a heart. The contrast between the characters he played and the person he apparently was in real life is genuinely striking. And what makes it worse is that fans of that era had very few ways to warn each other. There was no Twitter, no Reddit thread, no comments section. You just had to find out for yourself when you tried to get an autograph and got treated like you'd interrupted something very important. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn is someone people still celebrate as this icon of independence and self-determination. And honestly, fair enough, she was. She refused to play the Hollywood game on anyone else's terms. And in an industry that demanded women be compliant and available, she was neither. But here's the thing about refusing to play the game for Hepburn that extended to the fans who supported her entire career. Her position was essentially this. Her job was to perform, and that job ended the moment she stepped off the screen. She did not view fame as a reason to be friendly to strangers, and she made that clear in ways that ranged from sharp remarks to complete visible irritation when someone approached her in public. Photographers had it especially rough. There are multiple documented incidents of Hepburn reacting aggressively when cameras appeared without her permission. And while some people have framed that as empowering, the fans on the receiving end of her dismissals were just people who loved her work and wanted one moment. The interesting tension with Hepburn is that her independence was genuinely admirable in context. But there is a difference between refusing to be exploited by the studio system and making a fan feel foolish for admiring you. She often crossed that line, and the people who experienced it firsthand never quite forgot it. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's relationship with his fans is one of the most dramatic reversals in entertainment history, and I don't think people fully appreciate how stark it was. In the early 1940s, Sinatra was basically the first modern pop star. Girls were fainting at his concerts. He had this devoted, almost obsessive fan base, the Bobby Soxers, they were called, and he leaned into every second of it. He understood completely that their love was the reason he had a career, and he performed with that awareness. Then he got famous enough that the fans stopped feeling like an asset and started feeling like an intrusion. By the time Sinatra hit his Rat Pack era in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, his tolerance for public attention had essentially bottomed out. He became known for explosive, unpredictable reactions when fans approached him in the wrong moment or sometimes any moment. His security team was notoriously aggressive, and there are accounts of admirers being physically removed from his vicinity before they'd even finished saying his name. What's almost darkly funny about it is that the less accessible he became, the more his mystique grew. Being untouchable became part of the brand. So in a weird way, treating fans badly actually helped his image with certain audiences. It made him seem powerful and above it all. But if you were one of the people who got the sharp end of that, it was a completely different experience. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando is where this gets genuinely fascinating, because his disdain for fan culture wasn't just a bad mood or a preference for privacy. He had an actual philosophical problem with the whole thing. Brando is widely considered one of the greatest actors who ever lived. His work in A Streetcar Named Desire, the Godfather, Apocalypse. Now, there's a reason people still study him, but he spent a significant portion of his career openly questioning why any of it should result in strangers wanting pieces of him. He would reportedly turn autograph requests into uncomfortable philosophical exchanges. Someone would walk up with a pen and a piece of paper, and instead of signing it, Brando would look at them and ask why. Why do you want the signature of someone you've never met? What does this mean to you? He wasn't being charming or playful about it. He was genuinely challenging the logic of fandom in a way that left people feeling embarrassed rather than... The contradiction that people pointed out fairly was that Brando benefited enormously from the adulation he rejected. He negotiated record-breaking salaries precisely because studios knew audiences would show up for him. He used his fame to fund the personal life he wanted, including eventually buying his own island in French Polynesia. But the fans who made all of that possible, he seemed to regard them as an irrational phenomena he couldn't quite understand and didn't particularly want to engage with. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen built one of the coolest images in Hollywood history. The King of Cool, that's what they called him. And it wasn't just marketing. There was something genuinely magnetic about him on screen. Bullet the Great Escape. Laments, he projected this effortless, rebellious confidence that resonated deeply, especially with younger audiences off-screen. That confidence came with a side of hostility that caught a lot of people off guard. McQueen was deeply guarded and distrustful of public attention, and he did not hide it. Autograph requests were frequently denied, sometimes with harsh language, sometimes with a dismissive gesture that made clear the conversation was over before it started. He had a genuine distrust of what fame meant and what it required of him, and he dealt with that discomfort by pushing people away rather than finding any middle ground. The frustrating thing for fans was that his persona was literally built on being the guy who didn't follow rules and didn't care what anyone thought. So when they encountered him in real life and got that same energy directed at them personally, it was the rebelliousness that made him cool on screen translated into someone who could make you feel unwelcome just for recognizing him on the street. Banheiro Fields. W.C. Fields is a slightly different case, because the persona he built on screen was already cynical and his whole act was essentially, I find people annoying, and I'm not going to pretend. Otherwise, audiences loved it because it was funny and because they assumed it was a performance. It was not entirely a performance. Fields carried his on-screen abrasiveness directly into his everyday life. Fans who approached him, expecting the comedian, expecting maybe some of that sharp wit turned on them in an affectionate way, often discovered that the irritation was real. He had genuine, deep impatience with social expectations, particularly the idea that being famous meant you owed people your time or your warmth. What makes Fields an interesting case is that this actually became part of his appeal over time. Because his persona was so openly cynical, people sort of accepted the rudeness as authentic rather than taking it personally. There was a strange logic to it, of course. W.C. Fields is dismissive. That's literally the character. But the fans who got the real version of that cynicism directed at them, with no punchline attached, often walked away feeling differently about it than his general reputation would suggest. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart is someone whose real personality and on-screen image were genuinely close to each other, and that creates an interesting situation when it comes to how he treated fans. On screen, Bogart played tough, cynical outsiders who had zero patience for pretense. Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, Rick Blaney in Casablanca, Philip Marlowe in The Big Sleep. These were men who said exactly what they thought and found most social rituals beneath them. In real life, Bogart essentially agreed with those characters. His position on fame was that his obligation to the public was his performance. He showed up, he did the work, he delivered something worth watching, and after that, the transaction was complete. If you approached him in public expecting warmth or enthusiasm, you were likely to get sarcasm instead, or a remark that made you feel a little foolish for expecting anything at all. Unlike some of the people on this list, Bogart wasn't volatile about it. He wasn't going to explode or make a scene. He was just going to be very clearly, very articulately uninterested in engaging with fandom as a concept. And he had the verbal sharpness to deliver that message in a way that stuck with you. Richard Burton. Richard Burton is the entry on this list that I find the most fascinating, because his particular version of dismissiveness toward fans came from a very specific place, and he was completely upfront about it. Burton was trained as a classical Shakespearean actor. He came up through the stage doing serious dramatic work, and he genuinely believed that was the highest form of his craft. When he pivoted to Hollywood films and became enormously famous, especially after his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor turned into one of the biggest tabloid stories of the 1960s, he was conflicted about it in a way that he didn't really try to hide. He thought the celebrity worship culture was shallow. He said so openly in interviews, and because of that belief, he treated fans who approached him not with hostility, exactly, but with a kind of sharp, articulate disdain that was almost worse. He was intelligent and eloquent enough to make you understand precisely why he found your admiration lacking in some way. What's almost poetic about it is that Burton used his fame extremely well financially. He lived lavishly, collected expensive jewelry for Taylor, negotiated enormous salaries. He accepted every material benefit that came with being a celebrity. He just didn't want to pretend to be grateful to the people who made him one. Greta Garbo took a completely different approach from everyone else on this list. She didn't react with hostility or sharp remarks or volatile outbursts. She just disappeared. Garbo was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood during the 1930s and then in 1941 at the age of 36. She retired and essentially vanished from public life. For the next 5 decades, she lived in New York City, took walks in the park, went to galleries, and refused virtually all contact with the media and the public. Fans who spotted her in Manhattan quickly learned that approaching her accomplished nothing. She didn't acknowledge them. She didn't speak. She would simply turn away or walk in a different direction as if the interaction wasn't happening. She never signed autographs. She never responded to fan mail. She gave almost no interviews after her retirement. The strange thing is that this total withdrawal made her more fascinating, not less. The mystique around Garbo grew every year she stayed silent, to the point where her unavailability became its own kind of stardom. But if you were actually one of the fans who spent years admiring her work and finally found yourself 5 feet away from her on a New York sidewalk, the experience of being completely and deliberately invisible to her was reportedly quite jarring. Lucille Ball, and we're saving Lucille Ball for last, because in some ways this is the most jarring one on the list. Because the gap between who people expected her to be and who she actually was might be the widest of anyone here. Lucy Ricardo is one of the most beloved characters in the history of television. Funny, chaotic, warm, always getting into trouble, always meaning well. When I Love Lucy was at its peak in the early 1950s, Lucille Ball was receiving more fan mail than almost anyone in Hollywood. People felt genuinely close to her. They felt like they knew Lucy, and by extension, like they knew Lucille. What they didn't know was that by the time she was playing Lucy, Lucille Ball was also running DC Lou Productions, the studio she co-founded with Desi Arnaz, and managing it with an intensity and seriousness that was about as far from Lucy Ricardo as you could get. She was operating in a male-dominated industry where she had to fight for every inch of authority she had, and she protected that authority fiercely. The result was that fans who approached her expecting the warmth and playfulness of Lucy often encountered someone who was visibly irritated at being interrupted or blunt in a way that felt genuinely cold. She had no patience for people treating her like her character rather than like the businesswoman she actually was. It's almost understandable when you think about it from her perspective. She'd spent decades building something real while the world reduced her to a physical comedy persona, but the fans didn't know any of that context. They just knew that their favorite person on television had looked at them like they were in the way. Here's the thing that connects all 10 of these people. None of them were entirely wrong in how they felt. Privacy is real. Fame is exhausting. The expectation that public figures owe strangers unlimited warmth and access is genuinely complicated. But fans aren't strangers in the way we usually mean that word. They're the people who chose you, sometimes over and over again, for years. And the way you treat them on an ordinary Tuesday when no cameras are rolling, that's the story that actually lasts. So I want to know which of these surprised you the most, because I have a feeling some of you had very different expectations going into this video. Drop it in the comments. I read more of them than you'd probably think. And if you want more of this kind of deep dive into the side of Hollywood they didn't put in the press kit, hit subscribe. A new video is coming very soon, and it is one you genuinely do not want to miss.